Good morning, folks. I guess as people joining in, some are watching on YouTube. Very good morning to all of you. Hopefully, some of you attended Thursday's session, so you know exactly what we are doing here. Now, my name is Bashir Fancy. I'm the President and CEO of the Business and Technology Professional Association of Canada, which affectionately we are now calling it BIZTEC Canada. We're very fortunate, and we'll go into more, that when we have conversations like this, fancy that conversation on some very important topics that are impacting our lives. Today, I'm very fortunate as we have an important member who also happens to be part of our advisory board. So we are privileged and proud about that. So on the screen, you see Sylvia Kingsmill. She's the partner national leader, actually, regulatory and information management at KPMG. She has a pretty illustrious background, actually. I'll tell you a little bit, and then she can talk more about it. She was also the chair at the KPMG International Women of Risk Network. And trust me, as you see her talk, you will realize why. As I mentioned, she's on the advisory board of BIZTEC. She's a member of an advisor on ethical design and use of artificial intelligence, which is going to become even more and more important as we go by. Standards Council of Canada, or SCC, as some people know it. She was interim privacy officer at Life Labs. She was with Deloitte Partner National Strategic Initiatives. And one of the things that, and there's a long list, so you'll start to find out, and it's on LinkedIn, it's on our website too, that Sylvia had a very important and critical role in the privacy by design, and you'll see all the start to come out now. She's actually an attorney by profession, so when you see some of the stuff that come out, actually University Aura, you'll see why. So welcome this morning, Sylvia. It's fantastic to have you, and talk about privacy, and the title is just perfect. The pragmatic approach, because that's exactly what you're all about. And that's been my life too. That never mind about all that. Just what is the practical and right thing to do? So welcome first.
Well, thank you so much for having me, Bashir. It's always a pleasure to talk about very timely and important topics. And you're right about the things that we're going to talk about today. It's really about being practical and pragmatic, and just keeping things simple because these things can get complicated. And I think we just need to think about it in a very practical way, meaningful way, to do the right thing with citizens' data. So thank you.
That's fantastic.
Introduction.
Perfect way to start. Now, for everybody who's watching the situation, we had planned a certain way to approach this, but it's becoming more relevant with a little focus, slightly changed, but nothing in substance. Substance is still there, which is that we have had a change in the ministerial level shuffle a few days ago. Mr. Navdeep Bains is no longer in the portfolio. He was the kind of the architect of the bills, right? Sponsor is the correct word. That's right. Of the bill. And now with the change happening, we've got a new minister, Francois-Philippe Champagne. And so he'll have to deal with now. What does this mean? So that's a very good way to start. So Sylvia, why don't you lay the ground now that it's changed? What does it mean?
Sure. So why don't I contextualize this a little bit? Because Minister Bains has done a lot of groundbreaking work to try and foster a federal privacy bill that would help Canada with responsible innovation, especially around net new emerging technologies, and to balance that with the right of individuals to have their privacy. And so that was very well intentioned, and there was a lot of excitement in November of 2020 around Bill C-11, which is the Consumer Privacy Protection Act. I will call it the CPPA for short. And really the promise was to modernize, and the wait is finally over. I mean, this was long overdue. We all know that the federal privacy law that's currently in place is not fit for purpose. It's over 20 years old. It's simply just outdated, and it has not kept pace with technology. In fact, one of the biggest drivers for legislative reform or change has been technology. And really, it gives Canada an opportunity to get back into the saddle, to close the gap really with its international counterparts. And what I mean by that is that we have seen the enactment and the implementation of the General Data Protection Regulation in Europe. And that spawned a wave of data protection laws around the world. In the US, we have the California Consumer Protection Act, the CCPA, Brazil and Asia Pac. They've all enacted their own version of the GDPR. And really, GDPR was very foundational. It was the strictest standard for privacy protection. And it really was the EU trying to get 28 member states under one uniform, consistent privacy regime to put the user or the person back into the control of their own information. And really what they wanted to do was to stay competitive, right? And to be a digital leader. And you can't really do that with outdated legislation. And what was really truly a market departure from everything is the stiff fines and penalties that the GDPR introduced. And the GDPR is really important because what Canada was trying to do is emulate the GDPR and bring many of its provisions into Canada here. And the reason for doing that is because of the equivalency rule. There's this long-standing rule between the EU and Canada that, you know, they can continue to freely trade their data so long as we would have equivalent laws in place. And we've always had the equivalency standing. However, with the introduction of GDPR, which replaced the European privacy laws and introduced much stricter standards. And so in effect, really what we needed to do was reevaluate our own federal privacy law to ensure that we had the equivalency standing. So really, Bashir, you said, well, what do we do now? You know, so Minister Baines was the sponsor of this legislation, and now there's been a cabinet shuffle, and it was really quick to get second reading. And now we're in this hurry up and then wait, I call it, right? What do we do? While we're waiting for next steps. And really, I wanted to introduce the theme of, you know, we're not just going to wait. The threat landscape is constantly evolving, and regulatory expectations are already out there. And so, you know, I'm not saying panic or anything, but at the same time, it's an opportunity to get ahead of the legislative curve. So why don't we spend a little bit of time talking about, you know, what's the same and what's net new with this law, and why should we be paying particular attention? I would say what stays the same is the accountability measures that need to be in place with respect to having a responsible person, a CPO or a chief privacy officer or a data protection officer in place to develop and implement and oversee a privacy program, although the accountability measures will be a lot stricter under the CPPA. So there's a little bit of familiarity there. And the rules around consent, it's been inspired by regulatory guidance issued a few years ago around what is valid and meaningful consent. Although the CPPA will introduce some exceptions to the consent rules, and it was done in an effort to balance privacy with business. And to make it business friendly. And then, of course, there's always going to be an obligation to report privacy breaches, but there's a lot of things that will be different. So let me begin with the requirement to have privacy management programs developed and implemented. And really what is different is the amount of documentation that will be required in the form of due diligence, because now the regulator, the Privacy Commissioner of Canada, will have the power to come in and knock on your door and expect to see a privacy management program fully up and running and effective. So really what that triggers is, you know, the need not for just documentation, but to really look at the data life cycle from inception to destruction and think about all the potential uses of data and write a process around that. And much of this will be left to interpretation because the law won't be as prescriptive to tell you exactly what to do. But really what it is, or what it means on the ground, is to take a holistic approach to privacy program development And there's some really great guidance out there already that was issued by the privacy regulators. The feds and the provinces got together, the private sector, and they've come up with a document called Getting Accountability Right with an effective management privacy program. And what it does is it puts up these blocks, these building blocks of how to ensure effective privacy management. And it's everything from tone from the top, having a responsible designated person who reports to higher levels of the executive, and that was inspired by the GDPR, and to have a number of controls in place. I'm talking about people, process, governance, and technology, because you can't really look at these things in isolation. Typically, I see really robust technologies, but it's human error that will trigger a privacy complaint or investigation. So it's really looking at people, process, governance, and all of these controls holistically to ensure that the privacy program is effective. And the irony there is that I don't really see this as net new. I think it's already a regulatory expectation. So really, it's practicing good hygiene and really good business common sense. The second thing that the CPPA introduces is stricter consent. It's, as I said, it was inspired by the regulatory guidance already issued a few years ago around what does it mean to have valid and meaningful consent. And it really is to step into the consumer's shoes and to understand, what is my data being put to use, and is there transparency around that, and does the consumer really understand their choices? But the material difference under the CPPA will be that this all needs to be plain language to be truly meaningful. So consent can't be complicated. And there are a number of exceptions to consent that the CPPA introduces. I think this is a pro-friendly aspect of the legislation to balance the rights of individuals with respect to their privacy, and to also ensure that emerging tech gets out there and businesses enable compliance. And so some of the exceptions include business activities, to deliver a product or service, to exercise due diligence, and you don't have to get consent where consent isn't practical. There's also an exception to consent for the transfer of data to service providers. There's an exception to consent where the data is de-identified, and I'll come back to that in a moment, for research and development, for business transactions, if it's in the public interest, and for investigations. But the real market departure from the existing PIPEDA legislation, the federal privacy law, is around the de-identification of personal information and the exception to consent where information is de-identified. Under the current legislation, it appears that PIPEDA doesn't even apply to de-identified information. However, under the CPPA, it looks like de-identified data would still be caught under the scope of the legislation. The other true difference that I'm seeing is the business purpose limitation. Typically under privacy laws, you collect personal information for one purpose. You can't really repurpose the data for a secondary broader purpose without additional consent. And the CPPA seems to do away with that. So that could be a good news story for business, but I would think that a lot of the privacy pundits out there would be a bit surprised by this, simply because it opens up a Pandora's box to a bunch of uses. So that seems to be a bit fuzzy, and we would need a lot more clarity around that. And also, if you don't need consent for a secondary purpose, all it means is that you need to document that secondary use. And so it brings us back to a lot of the record keeping that the initial requirement for privacy management programs has introduced. So it seems like there's a lot of documentation, a lot of record keeping. The third requirement is a very broad right to automated decision making. And this is very important, especially in the world of AI. So any system used to make a prediction, a recommendation, or any decision about an individual, it has to be transparent and it has to be explainable. So in effect, really, what does this mean? It means you need to develop policies and procedures around the decisioning around algorithms. And you have to figure out which automated systems are in scope. And it would be a best practice to develop use cases to define the criteria for what does it mean to be transparent and what is it to explain something. And guidelines will need to be implemented for mitigating risk, and the feds have done a wonderful job. They've put out some guidance around algorithmic impact assessments, which could be really useful. And you need to appoint a data steward to oversee all of this, of course. So that is a big change in the legislation, and I think there's more to come around algorithmic transparency and explainability. The other net new difference or requirement would be around data mobility, and we've seen this through the GDPR, and what it really means is enabling an individual to port their data from one entity to the next. And this is really in line with international expectations. It'll introduce a number of interoperability challenges on the back end, so industry will have to figure that out. But really what it signals to me is the trend towards open banking, for example. Another area would be around the right to delete or dispose of data by the individual, or to withdraw consent for certain uses. Another area is around codes of practice and certification schemes to demonstrate proof of compliance, and we've seen this in the GDPR. In fact, we've seen a lot of this work already taking place in Canada with privacy by design and a certification scheme, and it's going to the ISO level with 31700 privacy by design. It's going to be an engineering standard focused on the data lifecycle. And what's really new and probably timely and I think necessary is stronger enforcement, Bashir, with checks and balances, which we haven't had before. So what that means is there's going to be a new tribunal, and the privacy commissioner will have order-making powers, which doesn't exist today. And he will be able to recommend penalties of up to 3% or 10 million of global turnover, and up to 5% or 25 million for the most egregious offenses. And there will be a private right of action. So lots of things to look forward to, lots of change. And I think a lot more clarity is going to be required in all of this. So I bet you want to ask me now, Bashir, okay, so what do we do now, right? There's been a bit of a wait and see. There's been a bit of a lag. The government is preoccupied with COVID, as they should. So what does this all mean, right? The first thing I would say is, and if we've learned anything from the GDPR implementation, the CASL legislation here, which is the anti-spam of Canada, and the CCPA in California, is not to panic. But also, it doesn't mean that we're just going to wait until the law takes effect in order to get up and running. In fact, there's a lot of reasons why we should be paying attention to this legislation now. The threat landscape is continually changing. We're seeing a lot more privacy breaches than ever before. There's a lot more class action lawsuits here in Canada. And there is personal and potential criminal liability. We've been seeing chief information security officers being criminally charged with privacy breaches. And personally, I think that the reputational risk is just too great to wait around to see, until the law takes effect. And you don't want to be scrambling at the last minute. You want to be proactively managing regulatory expectations. And I've seen it with a lot of the privacy investigations and compromised clients that we're dealing with today. It takes over your life. It becomes your day job just to manage regulators once there's in there. And there's lots of loss of productivity. Staff morale is low. So there's all these reasons why we should be looking to proactive privacy risk management than just looking at baseline foundational requirements that the law will set. And so it's going to be a bit cliche for me to say this, Bashir, that we should assess the risk through privacy impact assessments and risk assessment tools to understand an organization's current risk posture. But it's so true. Privacy impact assessments are very effective risk management tools. And there's been the generally accepted privacy principles, that's been out there for quite a long time. And that's an excellent document as a foundational start to privacy compliance and risk management, simply because it comes up with a number of measurable criteria and controls to test for. And it's been complemented by regulatory guidance. And I already talked to you about this, getting accountability right. It's an excellent document with all the building blocks. And really, I think much of the guidance has been shaped, and the requirement for having privacy management programs is really a result of the regulatory expectations. And I wanted to talk to you a bit about managing regulatory expectations. I don't think the law has ever been a silver lining to anything. Laws just set a foundation for compliance. They don't necessarily mitigate risk. It's not necessarily prescriptive enough for different companies of different sizes and scope to be able to come up with the right risk mitigation tools. So really, a lot of the work that we do is in supplementing and complementing the laws and regulations with standards, international standards like ISO 27000, which is security standards, or regulatory guidance. And really, it's about managing their expectations, because once they're on-prem, once there's an investigation, they're not going to look to the black and white letter of the law and do it, tick the box in terms of, do you have this in place for us to feel comfortable and confident that you have a solid privacy program in place? They're going to have a number of expectations that's just not written into law. And that's what we look to when we're helping companies and entities build their privacy programs. Bashir, you're on mute. I can't hear you.
I did put a, sorry, I said it was very powerful what you said. I'm really glad I stayed out of the way, because you're able to articulate that very, nicely and progressively in terms of, now what, there are a few things you said which are really critical. Number one, normally, any compliance standard is a minimum standard, right? It's not a maximum standard. And one of the problem, exactly as you said, people are ticking boxes. That can be a big problematic. Now, the second very important thing, what you just said just now, is you can't measure something. You can't figure out how you're doing. You can't measure it. You can't measure it because you don't even know what data you're storing, right? When you look at, like, one of the things we covered in the risk management, Chris Anderson and a couple of other people talked about it last Thursday, is that on the security side, is that we don't know what we've got, right? Yeah, you don't go to a safety deposit box in a bank to put everything. You need to understand what are the jewels you got, what you need to protect. And when you haven't done this review to understand, you don't know what, and therefore you can't measure it. So that's another problem. I think you talked about the fact that you don't need to keep ticking boxes, which means we need a culture, right? To create a culture in the organization of privacy, what data you're collecting, why you're collecting. And we're seeing right now significant problem with WhatsApp and Facebook and the type of information they're storing. Then they come out with the privacy policy they can't even explain properly, right? Which is create more confusion. So given everything what you laid out, which is brilliant, and the government will, with the new minister and all that, they will take a little bit of time to get the thing going again, which hopefully they won't take too long. As a company, you quite rightly pointed out, now what do we do? So the organization at the top also need to look at the fact that, by the way, your security and data breaches, as you quite rightly pointed out, are impacted by how you do this or don't do this properly. They're tied at the hip, right? You can't have security without privacy or privacy. So the question now becomes, in terms of the priority, in your organization, you walked into very large organization or mid-size, what are the things you would now look at and saying, given the fact that we don't know what the final thing of the law will be, but we have a pretty good idea where we're going to be, what are the priorities you would put on it?
So that's a great question, because the thing not to do, I would say, is start doing a delta analysis of, what PPTA requires and then what this bill says, because we don't know what the delta will be yet, right? I think it's too premature. So what I come back to is managing regulatory expectations. So if you look at the building blocks set in that foundational document called Getting Accountability Right,
Right.
I think that's a really good place to start. And don't forget, it's not as if you're starting from scratch. Okay, there are some similar requirements that will be still expected for organization to comply with. So it's not as if all of a sudden PPTA is completely overhauled and you're starting from scratch. I think that there is a lot that you can leverage out there. As I said, general accepted privacy principles, the Getting Accountability Right document. I think that's a really good place to start, because you're managing expectations and you can foreshadow that most of those expectations will be codified into the CPPA. So that's what I would say about that. And then it brings me to say something about some of the shortcomings that I see. I think industry will have a lot to say with respect to what the final draft legislation will look and feel like at the end of the day. I think there were some missed opportunities. I don't really think that it really addressed adequately, the consent provisions. I think we need a lot more clarity around that. And so that's why I would refer by default again to the guidance documents issued by the regulators around what is meaningful consent, what is contextual use, does it marry up to the expectations of the consumer at the end of the day, and are we being transparent with our information handling practices? Because notice and consent, isn't the best strategy. It hasn't been proven to be effective. And then some of the rules or requirements around data localization haven't been really adequately addressed. Protections around the misuse of data. And quite frankly, I didn't really see anything around the legal requirement for privacy impact assessments and the congruency with respect to what we're seeing in the Quebec legislation, which seems to be tougher in a lot of places. So I think what we're missing is a harmonization effort. You can't have a province have different rules than the federal law. I think there needs to be a huge effort with respect to how we're going to harmonize these rules to create a level playing field for all of these businesses who want to do business across Canada and then internationally. So if you have a global footprint, I would stick to the GDPR and regulatory guidance documents around that. And also remember that when the GDPR was about to be implemented, the regulators made it very clear, privacy compliance is a journey. Okay, it's a very effective privacy program requires resources, requires tone from the top, and it's not built overnight. So there will be some patience, I believe, and it's important to understand the personality types of the regulator. I know in Europe, different regulators in the member states had different approaches, but the one thing that was consistent is, what they find egregious would be any violation around the data subject rights, right? So lack of transparency, consent, and anything that impacts the individual with respect to how you deal with their data, especially when it comes to withdrawal of consent. So I would start to really focus on some of the procedural aspects of the privacy program, so that you're not getting ahead of anything by the time the law starts to shape up.
So we have, that's actually very good. We have a question here from Chris Anderson, which is asking, can you elaborate on what this new legislation means with the third-party service providers? It seems like business can collect personal information from an individual and use third parties to store, process, transport without disclosing and saying to the customer or any individual that the third party has controls in place. Actually, if you really look at it, a lot of the data is outsourced. So what do you think about that?
Well, under PPTA, currently, you can't really outsource your accountability. If you have data processing, then you're accountable for the data processing activities. So I would really try and look to best practice and look to, regulatory expectations. What the GDPR has done really well is, it has set provisions for data processors and data controllers to sort of balance the accountability. And I would really look at ensuring that, third parties who process data on your behalf have good practices, good hygiene, and of course you have to have a service provider agreement in place to lay that all out, but an effective way to really understand whether or not these things are truly happening on the back end, because it's just, it's only as good as the paper that it's written on. If it's just a service agreement where you have all these promises, you got to actually check it out. Have the ask them for the commitments upfront before you enter into a service provider arrangement, so that you have the satisfaction that you need. Just like under the GDPR, it's up to the data processor to enable the data controller to comply with the GDPR. So I would follow the GDPR approach with respect to data processing and third-party risk, because that's where we see a lot of the risks, right? It's the third party and your inability to have the transparency that you need around their information handling practices. So hold them to the exact same high standard that you would hold yourself to when you are responsible for data processing.
Do you think that the companies, it's tied into this Chris Henderson's question, and I saw this as a reason, and I'll talk about it in a minute, that the companies understand that they outsource the work, but they do not outsource the responsibility? I think there's confusion in some people's minds there, right?
And that's what I'm talking about, right?
Right.
I think you just need to look to higher standards for third-party risk management, and look at the control environment, the safeguarding that's in place by the data processor, because a lot of the privacy violations are triggered by unauthorized collection, use, and disclosure of the information. So I would really hone in on their safeguarding practices. And I would actually go back to something that you said, Bashir, which really made sense, and which I was actually looking for in the CPPA, is the data processing activities and a record of that. I don't really think you can understand how to safeguard data effectively if you don't understand where your crown jewels are, right? So data mapping is, I think, foundational to a really strong privacy program, right? Because then it gives you visibility into who's got access to what and why. So are you actually complying with the consent provisions? And then, which third parties have access to the data and what are their safeguards? So data mapping is really, really critically important in order for effective safeguarding to take place, and to have that third-party risk management protocol and the visibility that you need into, who's got the crown jewels, where are they, and, how can we effectively protect them? And this is in addition to the service agreements that we were talking about with respect to third-party risk management.
Right.
So that's something that I would advise to do. A lot of data mapping is very effective to good proactive privacy risk management.
It's very interesting. I remind some companies many times that you didn't outsource because the guy on the other side was fantastic at security and privacy and whatever. You outsourced because of a lower cost. And when they go visit the contracts, maybe some do, but in most times they negotiate the price. And when the guy is only making so much money, he's not going to start throwing resources and doing all this. So unless it's in your contract, unless he's obligated to do that, it's not going to happen. It's wishful thinking to say that guy is secure and that guy is secure, they will do that. What do you think about that?
Prove it. This is why I think certification schemes are really effective. I've seen a big pendulum swing lately in the last 5 years of my practice, where we had more third-party service providers and app developers come to us and ask for privacy by design certification, which is a privacy program, a certification program that I launched with Dr. Ann Kavukian, where they would look at their technology, and they would ask us to come in and ensure that they built the right functionality into the system architecture, into their operating systems. And we would look at their entire privacy program and issue a privacy seal that they then in turn would give their investors or the data controller. And it would actually create some trustworthiness and a measure of confidence, public confidence, for that emerging tech to actually be pushed out in the market. So I think the certification schemes and as a tool to demonstrate privacy compliance is very effective. It's law now under the GDPR, and we have yet to still work it out and crystallize it in the CPPA. But I think that's a really good step forward to making sure that the app developers and third parties demonstrate good due diligence.
So this is a very interesting thing. That's why I was talking about the visa part, that at Visa and PCI DSS, when we put it out there, you don't meet the requirements or you fail, we would penalize you or do whatever. We changed that because the truth is that I don't care how many people claim they're compliant. Really, the bottom line is nobody's really compliant, right? In most part. But the issue was not about getting everybody from here to there and be 100%, because it was never going to happen. The issue was to make sure that the behavior that they had to change, right? So there was two ways to look at it: turn around and penalize the heck out of somebody, or turn around and say, if you can demonstrate that you were doing all the right things at the time of breach or whatever, we would look at it kindly to say that you were doing the right thing. So in privacy, doesn't something that maybe the law says that I can't speak to that, you would know that if you have a plan to educate, communicate, all the things that are relevant, right? And you're doing this, you won't do that overnight, then you would be looked at it differently when it comes to penalties, right?
Yeah.
So what's your...
So you raise a really good point, because it is about a culture of privacy. Without the culture of privacy, which typically instills going beyond mere black and white letter of the law compliance, these certification schemes, just the approaches for compliance wouldn't really be rolled out the way that I'm seeing them being rolled out. Because pre-GDPR, I've seen a lot of window dressing. Post-GDPR, and now more than ever, I've seen a lot of good companies come to us and say, you know what, let's go through this exercise of understanding our risk posture, not because the law tells us to do it, but because we want to do the right thing with our customers' data. And again, the reputational risk is too great not to do that, right? We want to do the right thing with our citizens' data. And so I think behaviorally, things are changing. So, paying a fine is one thing. And this is not about the Facebooks of the world who can afford to do that. I'm talking about good Canadian companies who are fostering this culture of privacy that you're talking about, which triggers them to look at, privacy risk management in a really different way, right? So not the tick the box that we were talking about. Like, let's just do the right thing for our clients, right? Do we want to sell our clients' data and make a huge profit? I've had the CEO of a company that we certified say, no, actually, we turned it down because the reputational risk was too great.
That's a fantastic approach and thought process, which actually means if they were doing it rightly, my view is that the privacy done properly could be a very powerful competitive advantage, right?
It's a mind shift, right? It's looking at privacy less of a legal exercise and looking at it more as a business issue. And then getting all the traditional disciplines that have operated in silos for so many years to come together, because the most important thing that they're trying to protect is their crown jewels, their data assets. They want, in order to be risk intelligent around your data, to help the consumer make better decisions, to help the company make better decisions. It's all about, protecting your data assets. So it's a coming together so that privacy becomes a proactive risk management exercise and brings a multidisciplinary approach to data protection and privacy. So it used to be that the CPO, sat in the legal department. Well, I've seen a big shift. There's a shared accountability now. Privacy is making its way into a lot of risk management programs. And privacy isn't owned just by the legal department, really. It's a shared accountability across the enterprise. So it's a big shift in thinking.
I think it's a very powerful point, and I totally agree. In my visa role as risk management, I had that area, and actually it makes a tremendous sense to have it in risk management because of everything you discussed makes a lot of sense because just there are a lot of if you're going to do every legal thing or everybody says you'll be sitting with compliance department move your entire staff 100% to compliance. It's the common sense, right?
Privacy office doesn't have to be the office of the no, right? You want to
Right.
engage with the business. You want to enable them to get to market faster in a more agile and meaningful way. And so just looking at it from a compliance-driven, legal-driven approach is really a bit myopic, right? Because then it places restrictions on the data use a lot more than it would if you say to the business, well, yes, we can, but here's how. Here are some of the rules of engagement. Let's work together to make it more meaningful. And I would call this dynamic privacy risk management, where the law's static and it doesn't keep pace with technology. So it should be complemented and supplemented by these guidance documents, the ISO standards, national standards. I know the CIO Strategy Council is doing a great job with Canadian standards around identity management, AI, privacy. And so all of this put together really helps with the holistic and effective risk-based approach to privacy compliance.
I have a loaded question. Hopefully it is not, but it is one of the challenges we are finding, and we talked about it on Thursday, is, we were in the old approach of, 35 people hand out pieces of paper. There are plenty of programs out there where you go attend this, and we see less of the critical thinking, right? Which is the common sense approach that you're talking about. And that approach has caused, people like to call it skills gaps. It's more a lack of framework, right? Is what it is, really. That you are people who have the set answers, and when the question changes, now they have a problem. Now, in the corporate world, and in this area especially, because we have said it's a mindset, right? It's a culture, it's a mindset. If you're a CEO or you're a corner suite, isn't that where you start to turn and say, by the way, do my people understand the implications of every action they take or implication of the actions they don't take? And now they understand that. That requires very clear communication and the right people pushing it to make sure don't penalize people. If there's a process failure, always look at the process as opposed to people. Too many people, as I mentioned earlier, go and attack people rather than saying, hey, let's look at the process, right? This build C-level may not be the perfect thing. It's moving towards that, but we can make it perfect. We don't need to attack anybody, right? We need to understand where are the holes and work with them, right? Does that make sense, that whole mindset approach?
Yeah, I mean, I was talking to a CPO from a big financial institution, and I said, how do you make privacy sexy? Because it's not really the sexiest, most glamorous topics, right? And he said, we're just I bring a very simplistic approach, and I check in, and I try and make privacy stick across the enterprise by doing check-ins, quarterlies. I just don't want staff to be taking, privacy training through let's click to the next slide, click to the next slide. That's not really effective, because sometimes you're just going to click, and it doesn't even resonate. I think it's the human element, right? It's the ability to see someone talk about it passionately, and through quick training sessions around why it matters, what are the consequences, and how can we together, make it work. So I think remember I talked about people, process, governance, and technology, right? It shouldn't just be mechanical and controls driven. It should be there should be a human touch to it, right? It's how you effectively do the training and raise awareness and incorporate change management, right? Change management around information practices, data practices.
And that requires having that communication and talk.
And investment. It requires investment, resourcing. There's a huge privacy shortage of privacy professionals. And so, yes, it requires the resourcing, the funding, and then I follow the KISS rule, keep it simple, stupid. It is a lot of training, raise awareness and change management.
You know, the culture, it's funny because privacy is not dealt with any differently than they deal with the other side of the business. They don't like to admit that, but I've not only led that, I've done too many audits to know that it's actually otherwise. What they talk and what they do are two different things. And here's the reason why I say that, is that take a security issue, and it applies to privacy too, is when you go and say, by the way, here are the compliance, what they do in the companies is saying, let me see if I can reduce your scope so you don't have to do that, you don't have to do this. And they end up it's becoming a cost-saving exercise when it turns out to be very costly at the end of the day, right? Because they take shortcuts and they say, so in privacy, they said, okay, let's do that. Oh no, that's out of scope. And they go, how can it be out of scope? Step back and think, right? And that is everything you're talking about. So you're right, that it requires investment. Exactly as you were saying, it requires effort, time, commitment, and people walking the talk. It's not like, you know, the guy, CEO coming in and saying, okay, take my phone, I want this, this, and the other information. Meanwhile, they're telling everybody else to do something different, right? That now, to be fair, that thinking is changing a little bit, and that's a good sign. But we're waiting on the government to do all the, you know, like here's something I'm going to, I do not disclose stuff about bank from what I've dealt, but I will tell you a financial institution, and since it's global, because my role at Visa was global, we asked them to do something. And this is not a junior guy. This is right at the top. It's not the CEO. He said, why don't you make it a Visa compliance rule and we will do it. Mm-hmm. And my point was to him that, are you kidding me or what? You can't get this thing in to your people to understand? He said, will not happen. I won't get the money. I can't do this, that, and the other. If you make it a compliance issue, I will do it. So they were doing it as a compliance issue rather than the right thing that they should have been doing. Now, we've moved ahead from that, but not totally. There's still this question about you know, shareholder value and all that and the other. So we want to make sure the bottom line is still there, which is fine. You don't want to do business losing money, but you still want to spend in the right place and do the right thing.
Yeah.
And I think you articulated the situation. If people were to listen to what you said and think, you have put some pretty golden nuggets there for people to seriously say, I need to do this, because this is a common sense stuff, right?
It is. A lot of the biggest compromises or breaches that I'm seeing is just simple human error, but it's the simple stuff that gets a lot of the companies into privacy trouble. Over collection of data, you know, hoarding the data and not understanding the contextual use of it. And then the lack of just privacy by design thinking, right? A lot of the costly retrofits can be avoided if you just have a privacy engineering approach to a lot of the emerging tech. Because let's face it, digital is here to stay. Our lives are different, and they've been dramatically changed as a result of COVID and the pandemic. And so now more than ever, I think people have reevaluated what they really cherish. And if you ask any average Canadian, I think they would tell you that they really do value their privacy more than ever. So I mean, we do a lot of work in privacy risk management, and you know, we make companies whole and we help them manage their privacy risk. But I have seen a big shift in just thinking about, you know, what does it mean for us to have that luxury, that freedom, that right to privacy. And I would like to see our CPPA a little bit more inspired by that. You know, it's not just a consumer protection issue, really, it's a right. I like the way the Europeans have framed it, right?
Yeah.
It's a right and it's a freedom, and only until it's lost do you know what it feels like to have that taken away. And so I think it's the fabric of our Constitution and our democracy, really.
Absolutely.
In value.
It is so fundamental. And if I was talking to the kids, young people, anybody for that matter, you know, when you have WhatsApp type, and I'm not here talking about WhatsApp or Facebook, but I'm just making a point, it applies to me. They get it for free, and they don't understand that there is nothing free in life. Free means you are the product.
If people just understood that there's companies out there who are making a gazillion amount of money off of your data. And then I think we would look at things differently, and we are. I think Cambridge Analytica and everything that we're seeing today has resulted in people thinking about their privacy rights and freedoms, I think, a little bit more seriously.
Right, absolutely. That's it. You hit the nail there, and I think that's the understanding, and not just having blinders on. And the corporate world, you're right. COVID-19, a lot of people think that they created. COVID-19 did not create the problem. It certainly amplified them, but it exposed them.
Right.
It is really exposed. People are working from home. We can see people were not totally ready for it. Some parts were, but you can see 10,000 restaurants have gone out of business. 4 out of 10 are barely surviving, and we don't know where that's going to end up. Now you got new variants, so people need to not pretend that this is going away tomorrow morning. It's not. Our lives have changed, and changed permanently, right? How are you going to adopt? So what you said, if your entire message seems, you better start to adapt, right?
Right.
To the new reality, and that's going to require common sense thinking, not going to require ticking boxes.
Yeah.
And I can tell you, the reason you are able to talk like this is because you have the risk management and this other area together, because it's not about ticking boxes, it's about trying to understand. That's why you are able to articulate it so well. Other people are not. I mean, there are people out there selling services, doing whatever, but they don't think like that. They think in silos. And just because you read a couple of papers, unless you have done it yourself, you do not understand. You have a background where you actually developed this. You were involved heavily in privacy by design. So so we got 4 minutes left. What I'd like, why don't you take this to park? What are the key priorities to recap, right?
So the key priorities really is understanding and managing regulatory expectations, because I think looking to just the law as a foundation for a privacy compliance program isn't enough. It's beyond mere compliance. It really is about a risk-based approach to privacy compliance. So looking to standards, guidance documents issued by regulators is really, really important. And also having a way of thinking about privacy and really espousing and fostering a culture of privacy through something we call, it's a philosophy called privacy by design. Really, it just means do it every day, build it in. Engineers will build a building and it won't cave over you when you walk in because they built all the right constructs into the building. So why can't we have the same for privacy as a default? We're in an ultra digital world, and I think technology is good. It enables us to do many things, live and work differently, and it's convenient and seamless. But at the same time, all these protections need to be built in upfront. And so I think the CPPA is a step in the right direction. I wouldn't panic. I would start to look at it, and I would really try and measure your risk posture, an organization's risk posture through some of the guidance documents and tools that I've mentioned, because it'll help you start building your program and stepping into the law much more easily when it comes into effect. That's what
That's fantastic. But there was a question, if you're able to quick answer, I just spotted the director asked, should CPPA apply to small business, five-person business? His point is that in California, requires a company to do 25 million or keep 50,000 files or make half of the revenue from selling data.
Yeah.
Under that.
I think the key is you got to right size some of the rules for the nature and the scope of your organization, right? So, not everyone's going to have a Cadillac version of a privacy program, right? Like the banks are really well positioned. They've started to think about and adopt GDPR a long time ago, especially banks, Canadian banks with global operations. So I would really look at the requirements and really try and think about, the extent to which you will need to comply with the CPPA. So if you have to have a privacy policy that's transparent, keep it simple, right? Don't make it a 10-pager because your products and services aren't as complicated as a bank, right? A 1 or 2 pager, written in simple terms. What do you collect? Why do you collect it? Do you have the right consent? And more importantly, how are you going to safeguard the information, right? Because it's about the customer at the end of the day, right? Absolutely. Protecting their rights.
Absolutely. Yeah. There was a sentence I was using when you said that, it came to mind, which is very powerful because you're saying build those things in. And so I used to always say, bake it in, don't paint it on, right?
That's right. Right.
Bake it in, don't paint it on, because then it becomes routine thing, as opposed to somebody having to look over people's heads and doing it. You know, Sylvia, this has been a fantastic. You know, people need to listen to this again because you've not only put out a common sense approach, but very logically and chronologically, and it's literally a framework if they were doing properly, thinking. And you know, by the way, folks, we're proud because Sylvia is not only a part of our advisory board, a friend, and somebody you can see she can articulate this the problem, complex problem, and make it look simple to understand, not simple to execute because you need to get your will to do that. But Sylvia, I want to thank you from BIZTEC. Fabulous conversation, and you know, hopefully, if there are more questions, you can they can fire it in. We can ask you. Yeah.
So good talking to you, Bashir, and thank you for having me here to talk about a really important and timely topic.
Very powerful.
Time well spent.
Exactly. Thanks very much.
You take care for now. Yes.
Yeah.